name is Brandy. Welcome to my series, Shit That Happened When I Was a 911 Dispatcher. For today's story, I want to give a trigger warning for anyone who was affected by Hurricane Katrina. A little backstory for context. Hurricane Katrina happened in August of 2005. I was 20 years old at the time. I was dispatching in a kind of small town in Texas, and I had not traveled much. I had never been to Louisiana, and there's no way at that time of my life I would have known that today, sitting here telling you this story, that I would live in South Louisiana, right across the lake from New Orleans, and have fallen in love with the people of Louisiana and the culture the way that I have. The part of Texas that I lived in was very landlocked. It was not near the coast. Hurricanes were not anything that was on my radar. I didn't know anything about hurricane culture. We were made aware that our city was going to open an emergency shelter for what they referred to as Hurricane Katrina evacuees living down here in South Louisiana. I now know that there's a lot of people who don't appreciate being referred to as an evacuee, so I'm going to call them Katrina survivors, but the word that was readily used at the time was evacuees. The way my city came to open an emergency shelter was that we were told the city of New Orleans loaded people up onto commercial buses at the Superdome after the Superdome had flooded, and they needed to evacuate people who were being housed at the Superdome. So we heard that the mayor of Houston at the time gave their verbal word that at the Astrodome they could host X amount of people. And so they loaded that many people up onto buses, and we were told that they loaded women and children first and then males last. So the first 2/3 of the buses were allegedly filled with women and children, and then the last third of the buses were filled with males. We were told that this upset a lot of the males. Understandably, they did not want to be separated from their family, but they were told that it was for safety reasons, and they promised everyone was going to end up at the same place. Well, when they get partially to Houston, the Houston fire chief states that the Astrodome has exceeded its capacity and that they're not allowed to accept any more people. So one bus of women and children and several buses of males literally pulled over on the side of the road and had nowhere to go. They found an old abandoned mall that didn't even have electricity to it in Mesquite. It was called Big Town Mall, and they literally just opened the doors and let them stay there until they could come up with another plan. And the plan ended up being that the city that I worked for would open an old Walmart that had been closed down, and they would turn it into a shelter. It was pretty magnificent. In a matter of less than 24 hours, the community came together and completely remodeled this old Walmart, made it livable, turned it into what would become a fairly nice shelter considering the circumstances. Where dispatch comes into play is twofold. Number one, they needed people to work when the survivors arrived on site. We needed to make a spreadsheet that we could cross-reference with the Astrodome so that we could reconnect families and loved ones. Remember, this is 2005. Cell phones are not what they are now. They're not waterproof. And survivors were lucky to be there with just literally the clothes they had on their back. And they now were all traumatized even more because many of them were separated from their wife and their children that they were promised they would not be separated from. So we needed to create a spreadsheet system to communicate with the people in the Astrodome. And also we needed to run criminal histories and active warrant checks on people because we wanted to ensure that there were no violent criminals who had escaped from incarceration and or registered SOs that would be around children, because there were a few women and children that were going to be coming into the shelter. What I'm about to say, I want you to know, is coming from the naivety and the bubble of privilege that I lived in 2005, having never lived through a hurricane. And I have now been educated by so many amazing people that I call friends down here in South Louisiana who have told me their firsthand stories of Katrina. And so my story is this impactful compared to theirs, but this was my lived experience at the time. When we received the first survivors, it was, I think, 6 days after Hurricane Katrina. and I was not prepared for what I was going to see. When the survivors got off of the bus, they were still wearing the same clothes that they had evacuated in, and the smell was like nothing I have ever smelled before in my life. The coroner's office actually provided us with fluid that they recommended that we put under our nose. I did not do that because I thought it was extremely insensitive. I wasn't a social worker yet, but I guess I knew I was going to become one, or I always had it inside of me because it was important that I didn't make them feel any worse about their situation than they already did. But I will tell you that that smell is something I will never forget, and I'm sure that that pales in comparison to the smells I've heard people talk about that trigger their feelings of Katrina for the ones who lived here and survived it. This was also my first experience of learning that the Red Cross is virtually useless. We would think that they would have provided us with a template or some type of starting point as a cross-reference for the people that we were trying to connect in the Astrodome. They literally were like, no, just figure it out. So we just winged it and opened up Excel spreadsheets, and we would have people come up. There was, I don't know, 3 or 4 of us dispatchers. We would ask survivors to come up one by one, and we would ask them for their name and their address and their phone number and any identifying information. And the way that those people reacted when we asked them for their address and their phone number, I didn't understand it at the time, but I get it now. That was so incredibly insensitive and triggering because their address didn't exist anymore, and they knew they were never going back to that address. It was heartbreaking. We weren't really prepared to receive them like we thought that we were. We had a bunch of snacks. We had like packages of chips and like cans of soda, but these people had not eaten an actual meal in like 6 days. There were GI issues when they ate the junk food that we gave them, essentially. We didn't have enough bathrooms. It was awful. I will never forget this one sweet older lady. She had to have been 80 years old. And the only thing that she had with her was a Bible. And it was the strangest thing because the outside of the Bible was destroyed, like nasty. And then when she opened the pages, like the inside of the pages were pristine. And I'm not even like a super religious person, but I do remember that and I'll never forget it. As the days went on, we stayed up there. They asked us to pull shifts in dispatch, of course, all for overtime. So I took as many of them as I could get, just to have someone there as a point of contact. If someone wanted to come up and like ask for, had any contact been made down in Houston? Was there any progress on getting them reconnected with their family? And again, the Red Cross, I will never donate to them again. I have never given them a penny after I saw how they failed to come forward in this situation. But it was just heartbreaking. And it's not my proudest moment, but I will admit that at the time, I questioned, why did they have to be evacuated? Why did they stay? Why would you not leave? I didn't get it, but I get it now. I've been educated. I've fallen in love with South Louisiana. I understand why people stay. I understand how scary it is to decide when you need to evacuate. I also understand how expensive it is to evacuate and that not everyone has that privilege. And I also understand why people keep going back and rebuilding, because this culture down here is just intoxicating. But I was really ignorant at the time, and I was one of those people. Why didn't they just leave? Why would you go back?